With Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
No need to wait for the results of the upcoming U.S. election. Tonight, our favorite artificial intelligence pollster, Erin Kelly, will tell us what Polly the AI sees in America's presidential future. Then, our Ontario Hubs takes a look at how Northern Ontario is staring down the opioid crisis during this pandemic. And from reflecting on 50 years since the October crisis to how wars have shaped humanity, we've got the Agendas Week in Review. It's Friday, October 16th. I'm Nam Kiwanuka, and that's all ahead on the agenda. Back in 2016, not many pollsters correctly predicted Donald Trump's climb on his way to winning the White House. But that was just one in a long line of correct predictions made by Polly, the artificial intelligence algorithm. Erin Kelly is president and CEO of Advanced Symbolics Inc., the Ottawa-based company that put Polly into action. And Erin Kelly joins us now from the nation's capital for the latest in the U.S., and some local issues too. Hi, Erin. So nice to have you here. Excited to hear what you're saying tonight. Last night, it was supposed to be a debate, and then President Trump had the coronavirus, and then the debate commission suggested having a virtual debate, which he declined. Joe Biden decided to have a town hall, and then President Trump had a town hall on a competing network. All in one night. So we have a graphic here, and here's where the candidates stand. Biden is leading by a wide margin in both the Electoral College and popular vote. What does Polly have to say about the race for the presidency in the United States, Erin?
So we are definitely seeing Biden is far ahead as the map shows. And if you go to the map on our website, it's updated every day, and you can put your mouse over each state and see all of the issues and see what some of the sleeper issues might be for each candidate. But right now, we're only seeing about a 10% chance that Mr. Trump will be reelected as president. Now, he did have a bump after his bout with coronavirus. He went up about 20 electoral college votes, which was interesting. Now, the popular vote only changed by 1%, but we saw in some of those swing states, they liked seeing him pull through the coronavirus. This is a very big issue, especially in Florida, where the virus is raging and the population tends to be older. But he has since lost that lead with his behavior more recently. People see it as irresponsible. He's kind of jumped the shark a little bit with that. And we also saw that the debate, not having a debate, actually favors Joe Biden, interestingly enough.
That's interesting. Why is that?
Well, there's a meme, if you will, going around the United States, this sort of Sleepy Joe marketing that the Republicans have put out, and it has taken hold with people who wonder if Mr. Biden is too old, and there's a rumor that he's is not as sharp as he used to be. And in fact, he isn't as good on his feet and as good a debater as Mr. Trump. I mean, people can debate that, but he's not as quick as Mr. Trump. And so we found in the debates slightly favor Mr. Trump. So not having that and allowing Mr. Biden to speak and to address the nation would actually be favorable to him.
In 2016, a lot of polls show that Hillary Clinton would defeat Donald Trump. We know how that turned out. They were wrong. What are the challenges of polling during the race, during the 2016 presidential election?
Well, in the 2016 election, there were two main problems. Number one, people weren't willing to publicly say that they would say that they were endorsing Mr. Trump to their friends and online, and you could see it in what we call their digiographics, the things that they read and the things that they liked. But when pollsters would call, people didn't want to admit to a person on the phone or a person asking that they were going to vote for Mr. Trump because of the negative views of him being xenophobic and sexist and things like that. So they would tend to say they were undecided. But we could see, based on how people were behaving and what they were reading, that those people were leaning toward Mr. Trump. We also saw really interesting marketing going on. About halfway through the summer, Old GOP Grand Old Party supporters over 65 started to say that they were leaving the Republican field, and Hillary Clinton was very proactive in saying those people are coming to me. But that turned off some of the younger elements of the Democratic Party who saw Mrs. Clinton courting favor with older Republicans. So she lost some support of sort of the left-leaning Democrats. And then in the end, those people over 65 came back to Mr. Trump and those other people who were leaning Democratic stayed with Mr. Trump as well.
That is so fascinating because now the polls are suggesting that presidential candidate Biden is in the lead. Is there a path to victory for President Trump?
We're seeing less than 10% chance of that. Now, there are some sleeper issues. For example, if we get a vaccine or a credible treatment, not just a treatment that's for presidents, but a treatment for other, the general population that's credible, that would really do a lot to bolster Mr. Trump. If we see Joe Biden having Sleepy Joe moments where he looks to be not all there intellectually, if he stumbles or there's some sort of big moment like that, that's a sleeper issue for Mr. Biden. We also see that there is some concern that there are some left-wing radical elements in the Democratic Party, and if something were to come forward, because Americans aren't really keen on that, something would come forward to bolster that view, that could have a big impact on Mr. Biden as well.
I mean, the election is 2 weeks plus away, which is a lifetime in politics. When it comes to the lead up to an election, do you worry the poll results can shape public opinion, or in your view, are polls a reflection of public opinion?
Well, in my view, they're a reflection of public opinion, but it's definitely a big concern that they affect public opinion. And I think the political parties believe that. One of the reasons we don't work for political parties, we don't take contracts from political parties, is because often political parties will use these as weapons. And if you're working for a political party, they'll say, well, if the poll isn't favorable to my party, you can't publish or you can't speak to the media. And so definitely the parties believe that. I think there is evidence that that happens. In this particular case, I think Mr. Biden is so far ahead that it's not as much of an issue in this election.
Can Pauly tell us anything about what issues are motivating American voters right now?
Yes, for sure. Now, the coronavirus is the number one issue right now. And if you go to the map, you can actually mouse over by state and see what all of the issues are. So that's the number one: lockdowns, the economy. Interestingly enough, the integrity of the election itself is a big concern with Americans, and this favors Mr. Trump. And here's why. People who are centrist or who are more likely to stay home probably would vote Biden if they showed up at the polls. But because the integrity of the election is being questioned, whether or not the ballots will be miscounted or whether the president will even accept the results, that motivates people who are on the fence to stay home. Because they say, why bother voting if it's not going to count or if it's going to be corrupt? And so the more we question the integrity of the election, the more we help Mr. Trump.
And we should mention that there's no evidence to suggest that that is happening. It's just something that's been put out by Trump's side, right?
It's rumors. Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's talk about Canada, Ontario to be more specific. What does Pauly have to say about the way Premier Doug Ford has handled the pandemic?
Well, there's two very distinct points of opinion on that. So in March, when I was on the agenda, I said people were taking it quite well, and the premier was getting high points for his handling of the pandemic. We saw a sharp downturn in the first 2 weeks of October when the economy was shut down again. And not because the economy was shut down, but because people felt Mr. Ford took too long to shut down those hotspot regions in Toronto, Peel, and Ottawa. People are very upset, feel that the number of cases got much higher than it should have been, that he showed lower leadership. We saw negative comments about Mr. Ford increase by 60% over what they were in March. And people are also very upset about not having access to testing. They feel that people, because they're not getting tested, they're circulating in the population. People with runny noses that might have coronavirus are circulating in the population who shouldn't be, and the public is really demanding better testing. And there's definitely a strong feeling that the provincial government and Mr. Ford's government have mishandled this pandemic in the second surge.
We did see a lot of goodwill between the province and the federal government. But according to Polly, to what degree does the public hold the premiers more responsible for the pandemic than the Prime Minister?
Well, the Prime Minister's in a sweet spot, right? Because he's the one giving out the benefits and the, supporting Canadians. And it's the premiers and the public health bodies who are giving the bad news. You're not going to go trick-or-treating. We're closing down restaurants and pubs and doing the shutdown. So definitely the premiers and the heads of public health are taking a much bigger hit than the Prime Minister.
Has Polly noticed, because I know something that's been in the news a lot, return to school in September, has Polly noticed a shift since school started towards the feelings towards the Conservative government here in Ontario?
Well, there was definitely a feeling. Now, people are supportive of the schools opening, so we're not seeing people being upset about that. I think there's general acceptance that children are not big spreaders of the virus. They can get the virus, but when they do, it tends to be mild. So people are much more concerned about the pubs and the bars than they are about the schools. But definitely there's a feeling that we were not prepared for this opening. Especially with the testing and a lot of questions about whether or not the schools are too crowded and things like that. But it's not as big an issue as other venues like pubs and restaurants.
Does Polly see a way forward for the Ontario government to maybe shift the perception of how they're handling the pandemic?
The public wants to see action taken earlier when hot zones are being identified. So the public definitely is putting faith in the scientists and the doctors and want to see the Premier take strong action, even though it is difficult to shut down parts of the economy when we get into hot zones. They feel he has to do that. And lives are more important than the economy. And we're seeing that very clearly in the population. And more testing. People really want, and better understanding of how people, when people can take a test, how they get it, how long they have to wait. That's front and center right now.
It's a big weekend here for TVO. We have our telethon. And also it's a big weekend for you because TVO's original doc called Margin of Error is airing this Saturday at 9 p.m. Let's take a look. Sheldon, please roll.
I think AI tests the myths of neutrality when it comes to the political process.
Meet Polly, an AI algorithm programmed to predict the 2019 election.
We have found that for elections, we get the strongest signal from Twitter.
So that means we've got information from all over the place.
Now we have the opportunity to evolve this science for the first time in 50 years.
What is Polly telling you about the fallout from all of this?
So when you connect all that data together, it's remarkable the intimate picture it paints of the individual.
The traditional pollsters are afraid of this because it's the future.
What was it like to have a documentary crew follow you around for this documentary process?
It was difficult too, because I'm not used to that, right? I'm used to working very much in a lab and a science lab. We're not used to that, and so you feel self-conscious, but we were excited to have the opportunity to show before the election happened how accurate Polly is.
What misconceptions do you think people still have about artificial intelligence?
I think there's a view out there that artificial intelligence is affecting the election or affecting the outcome. Very clearly, what we are doing is reading what the population wants, what is important to the population. And often what you find is it's at odds with what the politicians think people care about. And that's what I find most interesting. We see still politicians focusing on scandals and things like that. And what the AI shows is people aren't interested in that. People are a lot smarter than I think the politicians give them credit for. Mr. Ford will say he's communicating well to the public, but the public is reading a lot more than what just the politicians say. They're reading what the scientists are saying, and they're seeing disconnect. So we see that all the time in elections. If I could give one word of advice to politicians, it's to stay away from the scandals and stay on substantive issues.
I think it's because you use Twitter as a source of information to gauge how people are, what they're thinking about and what's important to them. Do you see a future for Polly maybe being able to get the data of people who might not be on social media to get an idea of what they think as well?
Well, here's the thing. The science says not everybody's on Twitter, not everybody's on Facebook, but you don't need them to be because not everybody takes the poll either. Not everybody was part of the phone poll. And the whole idea behind statistics and representative sampling is that as long as the population that is there is representative of the whole, you don't need to get everybody. So we don't just look at Twitter. We can look at any kind of digital online, any kind of digital file, really. But it doesn't actually matter whether we're on this platform or that platform, as long as we are picking people for the sample who are representative of normal Canadians. So, and there's the algorithm is well set up to figure out what that looks like.
Something earlier when we were talking about the last U.S. presidential election, about people maybe not being as forthcoming about who they were swaying, if they were going to support President Trump. On social media, do you think people realize how many cookie crumbs that they're leaving for maybe someone like artificial intelligence to decipher where they really stand?
No, and it's important to understand too, we don't collect any names because we're not interested in individuals. We're looking at trends, but people aren't aware. So we don't violate anybody's privacy. If you have privacy settings turned on, we respect that. But what people don't understand is sometimes when they post on other people's walls, that's not private, right? It's only your wall that's private. And so probably they're not aware of it. They probably think too, I think there's a lot of paranoia that people are collecting more information than they actually are. That would actually be overfitting data. So you really are just looking for trends to see. And it's important to understand too that most of this work is done for very pro-social reasons, almost all of it. For example, Poly has recently won a contract to do prediction of COVID cases in the province, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And we do a lot of work with health bodies trying to figure out where in mental health and in physical health, where pandemics are going to break out. That's what most of AI is used for. Statistics Canada gathers information to do better planning. As long as you're protecting individual privacy, which we do with k-anonymity and differential privacy, you want to be able to see what the population is really concerned about, because that's how you develop policy that addresses people's concerns. People aren't concerned about which politician is having an affair with who. They really care about their job, their health, their families. And so keeping politicians focused on that, I think, is a good thing.
It seems to be, just to jump off the point that you just made, that some people are kind of like Teflon. I think Trump has been referred to as being Teflon. Why don't scandals hurt him?
It's not that scandals don't hurt him. It's he's very targeted. Scandals don't hurt anybody, and that's what I really wish that I could impart to politicians. Stop trying to focus on his errant behavior. If people feel he's creating jobs, he's getting a cure for the coronavirus, and if they believe that, then they will vote for him. They don't care that he's cheating on his spouse or that he's not a great dad or whatever is going on in his personal life. They care about their own personal lives. And so a scandal wouldn't hurt anybody if it didn't affect the population or their ability to make policy. This is why the Sleepy Joe thing is important for Joe Biden, because it makes people think, well, he won't make good decisions when he is the president if he has this issue. So it really is dependent on the effect that it has on the population and not just the scandals of this individual.
Earlier on you mentioned that after President Trump was diagnosed with having coronavirus, that his polls actually went up. There was a bump of support for him. That is impacting people. At one point, he referred to it as a hoax. Why wouldn't that hurt him? Why would it help him?
Yeah, because he turned it into, and it's really important in how you communicate the scandal. In the case of his bounce back from the coronavirus, his messaging was, now that I've had these treatments, I can bring these treatments to you. And that resonated with people. But in his actions after that, when he was taking off his mask and holding rallies, people, again, his popularity came back down. But as long as people think that he can help them and that he can get a treatment in and that we can open up the economy, people want to rally around that. But if they think that he's irresponsible and that it's going to hurt public health, then he comes back down. So it's really about his impact on the population and not his own personal recovery or not.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. The 2016 election, was it 80% that Hillary Clinton would win to become, would go on to become president? It was pretty high, right?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact percentage. Remember, she did win the popular vote. So
By
that's
3 million
something
or something,
I try to remember.
Right?
She won the popular vote. The thing in the 2016 election was how that vote broke up in the electoral districts. That's where she lost.
So do you see a day where Pauly can completely predict election results with 100% accuracy?
Not if we get down to each riding or each electoral college district. I think that's, in the documentary you're going to see, in the last federal election, we got within 2 seats for the Liberals. That's pretty amazing. And 3 seats for the Conservatives. So when you're looking at over 300 ridings, 360 ridings or something, that was, pretty bang on. You always have that margin of error, as, the documentary title suggests. So, we're pretty close now, but I think it would be hard to get 100%.
Just to go back on a comment that you made about this work that Pauly is doing, why do you think people are still afraid of AI?
Well, there's I think because they don't understand it. It's a great unknown, and I think people think it can do more than it actually can. At the end of the day, the AI is a big pattern recognition machine. It's just doing what we could do with statistics, but doing it on a much larger scale. But she's not changing people's minds. People have their opinions, and the AI is not changing that. What she's doing is understanding what their concerns are. That's and how those concerns that they have impact how they vote.
Well, we're going to learn more about how Pauly behaves and about AI this Saturday. As I said, Margin of Error is premiering, world premiere on TVO, 9 p.m. Erin Kelly, as always, it's been so great having you here. And I know we'll probably have you back before the election on November 3rd. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.
Parts of Northern Ontario have been hit hard by the opioid crisis, with deaths rising during the COVID-19 pandemic. Homelessness and poor access to services have made an already difficult situation worse. Nick Dunn is our Ontario Hub journalist covering the Northeast, and he joins us from Sudbury on what he's hearing from those working on the front lines in Timmins and beyond. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jan.
So in 2015, this issue was considered a crisis. Here we are 5 years later, and we're still talking about it. Remind us why opioids are so dangerous.
Well, first of all, Jan, opioids are a synthetic opiate, morphine being a derivative of the poppy plant. You see fentanyl, the most common opioid kind of on the market, is about 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine, according to the CDC. And other substances like carfentanil are 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. It can be a highly toxic substance, and you also see it mixed in with other substances. So whether that be your benzodiazepines, your stimulants, like cocaine or speed, it gets kind of cut into everything. And, overdoses can occur very simply, even if you're not specifically using fentanyl.
Now, I want to talk about your region specifically and Northern Ontario. This is an area, of course, that's bigger than France. And so there are a lot of complex issues. How pervasive is the opioid crisis in Northern Ontario?
Right. Well, to give you kind of a perspective here, in 2019, the rate of deaths, the rate of hospitalizations in both the Sudbury district, the Manitoulin district, and the Porcupine Health Unit, which looks at the Cochrane district primarily, these all had more than double the rates of deaths and hospitalizations that were in the province at large. As you mentioned, part of the problem is the sheer size and scope of this region, and that people are dispersed quite far away. It means that EMS is it's harder for them to access individuals who are in need of a call. It is more difficult to access services which are concentrated in cities. You could be hundreds of kilometers away from a city, and you don't have many available services around you.
Now, you've been on the ground researching this issue for a couple months now. Why do you find it so important?
Yes, well, it's the opioid crisis is a crisis in of itself, but it is largely a symptom of other things. It's a cross section of so many different social problems. You're looking at housing, you're looking at mental health services, you're looking at, especially in Northern Ontario, in the Indigenous context here, we're looking at intergenerational trauma, we're looking at sexual abuse, we're looking at systemic racism as a result of, having trouble accessing and navigating these systems that may not be culturally designed for certain communities. So while opioids in itself are an issue, it's really a cross-section of a multiplicity of these very kind of complex social issues.
Now, as you mentioned, it's a very complex story, and as journalists, sometimes we're restricted in terms of word counts for our stories. I noticed that you put a little bit of your reporting in a Twitter thread, and I actually want to pull up a board, and it reads, "I met Pat at a gathering spot that used to be secluded by bushes. The city cut them down to disperse the people who use drugs there. Folks don't want to use in public, and when these spots disappear, they do it in open or scatter further into the bush, further away from EMS." Tell me a little bit about Pat. What can you tell us about him, and how did you meet him?
Yeah. So I was on an outreach tour with Living Space, which is primarily a housing organization in Timmins, but they do harm reduction services as well. I met Pat at this spot. It used to be kind of bushy and secluded, where people would go to use. Now, the city had primarily cleared it out, the bushes, so that it became more open, kind of dispersing people. Pat was coming back from dinner. He had just picked up his meal at the shelter nearby. And, we just got talking about the situation here. He has substance abuse problems. He's originally from the James Bay. I think he pointed out some of the issues of race that kind of factor out through this whole broader context in Northern Ontario. I mean, you look at the Cochrane district, the Indigenous population comprises about 16% of this population, but the homeless population is somewhere around 50% Indigenous. I mean, the numbers there just paint a picture as to, these inequalities that exist in Northern Ontario that are very severe and causing lots of harm to people. But I think, to exemplify this, Pat made a very brilliant observation. There was a lone birch tree that was left amid all these bushes, and he points at that. He says, you know what pisses me off? That the only tree they leave up there is the white one. And it it was he was joking, but at the same time, it was a very kind of prescient, frustrating reality that he pointed out there.
I want to actually bring up some more images that you took while you were on the front lines. This image right here that we're looking at, I believe, are two outreach workers. Tell me kind of what this story or what this photo shows and what you kind of saw when you were out there.
Yeah, so we went out on the streets of Timmins. We were, checking in on people. Well, they were, I wasn't, seeing how they're doing. They were offering, a clean supply of needles, things like condoms, various kind of contraceptions and kind of harm reduction tools, I guess. And they were also picking up needles, kind of scouring kind of common areas to use. You could see there was a woman on the right. It said nurse right behind her, on kind of her backpack there. She is not only a harm reduction manager there at Living Space, but she is a nurse. And many people struggle going to the hospital. They don't feel comfortable there. They don't feel safe. And she conducts a lot of primary care. People would rather let their wounds fester at times than go to the hospital. And, she's basically doing first aid and basic kind of emergency room work on these individuals while on these tours, just kind of talking to people, making sure they're okay, just trying to build a relationship, build some kind of trust, and offer a sense of hope and human dignity that is inherent to everyone.
So, Nick, we actually have another photo here. Tell us what we're looking at.
Right. So this is a bit of a kind of a tin can encampment, if you will. The graffiti there says Hobo Inc. This isn't too far off the road, the main road in Timmins. People are, stuck between living on the streets where there's threat of being robbed, of being sexually assaulted if you're a woman, of being kidnapped. But if you push out further away into the bush, into these camps, I mean, it's pretty dangerous. This is bear country in Timmins, and that is a very real concern that I don't think a lot of people consider. That there are a lot of bears on the outskirts of these towns, and if you're living in a bush camp, that is a very real possibility. I mean, if it's a possibility while you're camping out around here, just recreationally, I mean, it's just incredibly dangerous, and it's at the back of people's minds, and it limits their ability to sleep.
Nick, I want to thank you so much. Of course, a very important story from your region, northeastern Ontario and northern Ontario. And of course, next week, we're going to actually get into this a lot more as you're co-producing a segment on the opioid crisis in Timmins. So we'll look forward to that. I want to thank you again so much.
Thanks so much, Jan.
The Agenda this week spoke to historian Margaret Macmillan about how war has shaped humanity, debated the future of so-called Piersonian diplomacy, and heard why putting local food first is better all around. The Agenda's Week in Review begins looking back a half century to one of Canada's defining moments and the actions taken to confront domestic terrorism during the October crisis.
Mr. Kotler, the most shocking part of the entire October crisis, I would suggest, was the killing of Pierre Laporte, only the second political assassination in Canadian history. And I wonder, when John Turner, the man you worked for at the time, for whom you were the special assistant, when he found out about it, what was his reaction and yours?
Well, John Turner, like I think all the members in the cabinet, were both shocked and pained when they heard about this. This was part of the atmospherics that were then riveting Quebec. I was at that point, while I was a special assistant to Turner from 68 to 70, I had then taken up a position at Osgoode Hall Law School as a professor there. So at the time of the War Measures Act, I was at Osgoode Hall Law School and traveling to Ottawa 2 days a week, and the atmospherics were different. In Quebec, there was the atmospherics, as Marc Lalonde described. In Osgoode Hall Law School, there was the kind of academic critiques of what was happening in Quebec, namely that the arrests were arbitrary, lack of due process, etc. But if you were in Quebec, the mood, and I went to Quebec at the time, the mood was entirely different. And I think an important point is that all the members of the legislature from Quebec and the Quebec members of the federal parliament not only all supported this, but all called for this decision to be made. And so if the decision to invoke had not been made, one could have said that the government would have been acting in an anti-democratic way or in an anti-federalist point of way. In other words, not responding to the representations that have been made consistently, as Mark had said, and that were coming from Bourassa, Drapeau, and the like at the time.
And Monsieur Lalonde, were you with Prime Minister Trudeau when he found out about Pierre Laporte's killing?
No, I was in my office and immediately phoned him. We were both devastated by such an event, frankly. We had, with the government of Quebec, had started negotiations with our agreement on trying to get release of the two hostages. But the negotiations were canceled by Robert Lemieux, who was a lawyer for acting on behalf of the FLQ. And these negotiations were canceled, in fact, on the 15th of October, the day before the War Measures Act was invoked. And a few days later, Laporte was killed. We were totally shocked, and it was just unbelievable we were devastated by that event, I must say.
I should follow up with this because in the last few days, Pierre Laporte's son has made public the following statement. He felt that his father was, in some respects, a sacrificial lamb to the whole process, that the government, in essence, sacrificed him in order eventually to get to the finish line in this crisis. What's your view on that, Monsieur Lalonde?
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for Mr. Laporte's son, and I can understand that he's still grieving about it. But his analysis does not correspond to the facts.
Let's remind everybody, the average age in Quebec today is 42. Back then it was 24. It was a much younger place.
Exactly. So what about the youth? It's, you know, the energetic, irresponsible, idealistic youth. It was heated. So, and also the idea of the working class and the global working class and the union and the international was very appealing to these young students. So this is not a coincidence that the arguments came from the books in the street. And Quebec does fear that without commemorative vigilance, history would sweep away, and that we will forget this energy, and that the class, the working class, is a valid paradigm to understand Quebec's history.
But this was not a socialist revolution. It wasn't a working class revolution. Quebec was improving. Thing is, all we can say, history of Quebec did show a considerable amount of discrimination and injustice towards Francophones. But since 1960, there had been a considerable improvement, and both in the education. You talk about cultural deprivation, but this was the 60s were a great period in Quebec literature, in Quebec theater. So there was no real justification at all for resorting to terror. On the other hand, I can't see any connection between the repression and the arrest of several hundred completely innocent people and the solving of that crisis, because Quebecers would have turned on the students, would have sent them home very quickly anyway.
Well, this is a reference to the... Sorry, Darcy, go ahead. Pick it up.
Just to take up that point, you know, let's remember a few things that happened in the 60s. Street demonstrations going back to December of 1962 were large, unruly, and sometimes violent. And there were regular street demonstrations on Victoria Day, Holiday Week, La Fête de la Reine, which rubbed young Quebecers the wrong way. Dominion Day, there were protests. Then we get to the St. Jean-Baptiste Day Riot of 1968, famous incident. There was also the St. Leonard School Riot of September 1969, a very violent incident. There was the Taxi Riot of October 1969. So there had been repeated street demonstrations and 3 riots between June 24, 68 and early October 1969. Not to mention the McGill Française movement of March 1969, where the unions and university students came together. They put 9,000 or 10,000 people in the street in Sherbrooke Street, march west, major security operation to make sure that to keep these the Anglophones and these protesters apart. So there was ample evidence to certainly Mayor Jean Drapeau of what was these demonstrations, how they could evolve, how they could spin out of control, and how you could have this chaos, rioting chaos and bloodshed in the streets of Montreal at the moment of grave national crisis. And that's why you had to, and I agree with you, Julius, that the arrest and detention of these people, these 497 people, was obviously arbitrary. It was obviously a violation of their civil rights. But you have to say, what's the greater good? Are you going to allow chaos and bloodshed in the streets, or are you going to maintain public order? It was just a simple choice.
But you know, the riots in Montreal were less than in the United States in those days, less than in France.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think that we have to distinguish between the support, the apparent support for the FLQ in the early days of the October crisis and the reaction when Pierre Laporte was killed. Because I think in the early days, yes, there was euphoria among some of these radical young sovereigntists, particularly at Université de Québec, because that was an absolute hotbed of radicalism. It was a newly founded university. And I don't know if there was anybody there who wasn't a sovereignist. It was very radical there. But when Laporte's body was found in the trunk of a car at St. Hubert Airport, people were shocked. And the air just went out of the balloon. And I don't think this was because of the War Measures Act. I think perhaps the War Measures Act obviously had a visual impact. But the army was in Quebec before the War Measures Act. Okay, there were two events, calling in the army and declaring the War Measures Act. And there was a wonderful column by Natalie Petrowski in La Presse, who was 16 years old when the October crisis happened. And she talked about being a radical young student. And she was a bourgeois, well-off, from a nice part of town. And she talked about the early days of, pumping her fist and going FLQ. She didn't actually go to the rally with 3,000 people at this Paul Sauvé Arena. But she was fully supportive, as were a lot of students. And then she heard on the news about the death of Laporte, and she felt devastated. And she was not the only one. Many of the people I spoke to for this article said that when they learned of Laporte's death, suddenly everything came crashing down for them. Because I don't think that these young radicals, it was like Che Guevara, who in a college campus in the 1960s in the Western world did not have a poster of Che Guevara on the wall? We thought he was great. He had a cool beret, right? He wore a star. But in reality, did we really want people to die? I don't think people saw that coming.
We are going to go back to September 1792, battle in Valmy, France, between France, between the ill-equipped French and the powerful Prussians. And you tell us a revolutionary form of warfare was born on that day. What was it?
What it was the difference between the two types of soldiers who were fighting. And the Prussian forces were very much the old style of the 18th century soldiers, highly disciplined. I mean, it often took 5 or 6 or even more years to turn them into the sort of disciplined soldiers who would do exactly what they were told. And they fought in a very predictable way. They fought in very neat lines. It was very standardized. And they found themselves up against French revolutionary soldiers, because by this point there'd been a revolution in France and there was a new sort of government and a new sort of feeling afoot in France. And the French revolutionary soldiers weren't trained, weren't disciplined, and didn't behave in predictable ways. They didn't march neatly onto the battlefield. They came streaming on, often singing revolutionary songs, shouting Vive la République, Vive la France. And they streamed across the field, apparently not worried about dying in the cause. And this actually stunned the soldiers on the other side and the generals on the other side, because they hadn't seen soldiers who fought like this. A lot of them found it horrific. And in the end, it wasn't a great victory, in fact, for the French revolutionary soldiers, but it was important enough that they had held off this highly professional army. And I think something new was being born there. That Goethe, who was a very young poet at that point, was there, and he said something new has come about. And I think what we began to get was people fighting for a cause, and it had happened before in history with religion, but this time they were fighting for the nation and fighting for the revolution. And it did make them formidable because they didn't understand they weren't meant to take risks. They were prepared to die for a cause, and that made them very difficult to fight.
In which case, the emergence of this nationalism, which you point to that place and that time as emerging in some respects for the first time, what do you think it meant for future wars going forward?
Well, what it meant, I think, in the 19th century was, as you got more and more nationalisms developing, it meant that you got a new kind of relationship between the country and the individual living in it. Before the French Revolution, people were subjects of the ruler, and that was true pretty much across Europe, although you had some countries like Sweden and England where people felt more as if they belonged to, they owned their own government. But what happened as a result of the French Revolution and the growth of nationalism is people felt they were part of something called the nation. It was something bigger than them. It had existed before them. It would exist after them. And it was in a way a cause. But they also had a different relationship to their own governments. If you vote for a government, then you, in a sense, own it. but you also have an obligation to it. You need to come to its defense and to the defense of the country if it's at war. And so what we got, I think, in the 19th century was the spread of a very different sort of motivation for going to war, and among those who actually were going to fight it.
Let me pluck a quote out of the book here, and this will take everybody back here to basically the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. V.W. Herbert, you quote him in the book. This is a British military journal, and here's the quote. "Is not war the grand scheme of nature by which degenerate, weak, or otherwise harmful states are eliminated from the concerted action of civilized nations and assimilated to those who are strong, vital, and beneficial in their influences?" I mean, this is really might makes right at its most basic. How long did this type of thinking go on for?
Well, I think it went on for quite a long time, and I find it absolutely horrific. This idea that war is somehow a purifying and a cleansing thing. It's very much influenced by the thought of Charles Darwin, although I think he would not have approved of the way in which it was applied to human societies. The idea that there was a struggle for survival, and the fittest, those who were ready to struggle, those who were most adapted to their environment, would survive. And so there was almost a moral thing that if you failed to survive, well, then you were probably weak and degenerate and should disappear anyway. And it was something that helped to fuel the European expansion of the 19th century into places like Africa, a sense that they were somehow a superior race. I think it's appalling, but I think we need to understand it because it was a very powerful motivating force, and it wasn't just confined to a few intellectuals in universities. A lot of people felt this, and a lot of people talked in terms of their nation, or as they often called it, their race, as though the English race was superior to the French race and therefore deserved to do better and deserved to conquer and survive, or the German race was better than the French race, or the Russian race was better than the German race. I mean, this was the language of the time, and you can see where it would lead, and it did lead to often ferocious wars.
When we talk Piersonian diplomacy, what do we mean?
Well, I do make a distinction between Pearson, the man, the diplomat, and Piersonian tradition, which is a celebration of something that he did. And to give you an example of what that is, when you visit the headquarters of our Foreign Service in Ottawa, it's called the Pearson Building. You walk in, you turn to the left, there is a shrine with a gold medal. It's the Nobel Peace Prize that Lester Pearson won in 1957 for creating peacekeeping. At a time when Canada was searching for a new national identity, when we were dealing with a rise in Quebec separatism, we were breaking away from the UK, we were trying to negotiate a new relationship with the United States, that international accolades that came from that accomplishment in the international system gave Canadians great pride. I think we have been genuflecting at that altar, and I count myself as a former diplomat as part of that tradition, because the story that it helped us tell about who we are as Canadians has been a really central part of our foreign policy. And for many years that served us well. I think the world has changed and it no longer serves us well now.
Well, all right. Follow up then if you would. Do you think it's time to bury Piersonian diplomacy now?
I do, and I think the real, the pin dropped for me with our failed bid to win the Security Council just a few months ago. I can totally understand why Canada would want to pursue a seat on the Security Council. It's the top table of the multilateral system. It's the place where issues of war and peace get debated. Of course, that's where Canadians want to be. And yet most Canadians, I was surprised by their opposition, even their hostility to the fact that the government was pursuing this. And it occurred to me that there's been a dangerous gap that's emerged between what Canadian citizens feel about international relations, the level of fear that we have as the world has become much more dangerous. There's a growing disorder, and this continuing pursuit of a story that we like to tell about ourselves. And I think that gap is dangerous. We need to be much more assertive and ambitious in our foreign policy. We need our citizens to be on board. And so I think we need to get past this identity building or storytelling component of our foreign policy to confront the realities of today.
Well, Jennifer Welsh, the Prime Minister certainly seems to think that Piersonian diplomacy may be in trouble right now. What's your view on whether the so-called rules-based international order still works?
Well, he's right in that a lot of these institutions are paralyzed by great power politics. You know, if you think about the UN Security Council as an example, it's not just the fact that it's failed to agree on effective action in Syria, but that with respect to an issue like the current pandemic, it took months for it to even be able to pass a resolution. But I do think we need to be careful about saying that the entire system has fallen apart. We have a number of institutions globally. Not all of them are at the global level. Some of them work at regional levels. And so what we need to be thinking about along the lines I think that Ben has suggested is where it makes most sense to solve the problems we face. And it may mean, Piersonian diplomacy, if it were to be revived, it would be looking for creative new ways to cooperate. And I think that part of Pearson's agenda is very important. Much of what he did was in a context of rivalry between great powers that had made cooperation difficult, and trying to find a way through that path. I don't need to tell the members of this panel, that we face the same kind of rivalrous situation where the U.S.-China relationship infects almost every aspect of international relations today, whether it is the UN Security Council, whether it's trade, whether it's the digital world. So that part of Pearson's legacy, I don't think is dead. I do think the Canadian tendency to support institutions for the sake of institutions, that does have to be rethought. And we need to be much more clear-eyed about the kinds of institutions that either we want to build or that we want to invest in.
You did mention in your book that we apparently in this province import, I want to get the number right here, $20 billion worth of food every year, and half of that, you say, could actually be grown here. If that's the case, why do we import so much?
There's a lot of there's a lot of silly things that stand in the way. And when I say silly, I'm talking about like trade deals. NAFTA is perhaps one of those pieces that has these sort of deals that stand in the way of us having the ability to prioritize our local consumption of our domestic production. And that when you hear, like, I think some stats or something as crazy as for every 4 apples that we grow here, we import another 3. And then 2 get exported because of existing trade deals, and really just the fact that our food supply is not protected domestically. And that seems insane to me, particularly at this moment in time.
Could we actually make enough food in this province or in this country in order to satisfy our desires?
Oh, we could. 100%, right? We absolutely could. Or even, I don't think, like, it's not a completely black and white conversation, because I think because there's limits to what we can grow here. And even if we all ate only the things that were grown here and only imported the things that were not, I'm talking lemons, avocados, things like that, our food system would be a much stronger version of itself.
So I'm trying to imagine, if we all decided tomorrow that we're no longer going to eat foods that are imported from other countries, what would that do to the whole supply chain? What would that do to the way we do things? I mean, pretty disruptive, I think. For
sure. Yeah, to your point, I think we need to have a sort of weaned or graduated process there, because we have some very solid national and international distribution channels that are well entrenched and supported in this country. And so what I am hoping for, and what a lot of my colleagues are hoping for, is a more gradual shift, so that we have a more robust regional and local system, so that in moments like this, because for sure this is not the last time we're going to have to deal with something as intense as this pandemic, we have more resilience and ability to pivot on the ground at the grassroots level. It's not an overnight swing thing, because that will topple everything, right? We need more of a gradual weaning in, and hopefully that gives us time to get the public, to get the public on board, really.
No, I take your point, but I wonder, is that something that has to happen at a political, policy-oriented table?
Yes.
It is, eh? It's not something that individuals can just make individual decisions on.
Well, I think we're seeing the reality of those individual decisions right now, right? Some wonderful stats are, like, in the last 10 years, we've seen a 400% spike in the number of farmers markets in Ontario. And that is a very encouraging sign that the desire for locally sourced food is as great as it is. So communities can definitely sort of vote with their dollars on the ground, but there is a lot of government policy that keeps those national and international distribution channels as secure and robust as they are. And that's the kind of stuff that I would like to start untangling a bit.
Do you worry at all, though, Joshna, that if we decided to buy, I mean, it's impossible to do exclusively local, but let's say much more local, that other countries in the world would do the same and not take our stuff, and we'd lose markets for our goods that we'd want to sell to?
I don't. I think that there's another way for us to support our local agricultural economy. It does not, like, for sure there's a reliance on the sales that come from our exports, but I don't know that our food needs to be in that pocket, right? We have lumber, we have water, we have all these other natural resources and other bits that we export. But I think it is actually a food security issue that we don't first focus on making sure that we all have enough to eat and then consider what exports look like, right?
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, October 16th, 2020. Coming up next week, we'll ask if we really need politicians anymore, speak to the New York Times' Nicholas Kristof about his recent book, and we've got a feature interview with Barbara Emil about her tell-all memoir. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Please stop by over the weekend as we're celebrating our 50th anniversary on air with a telethon. We've got lots of great stuff from our archives and with special guests, so hope you can tune in for some of that. Have a terrific weekend, and Steve, Jan, and I will see you tomorrow for the telethon.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.